Thank you. So welcome everyone to this session on law and poetry, and thanks to Sora Han for agreeing to host and moderate today. Sora is professor of criminology, law, and society in the School of Social Ecology at UC Irvine. She also holds appointments in comparative literature at the law school and African American studies there. She has published two books earlier this year, work of poetry, To Regard a Wave, out from Salva Oscura Press, and Move 49 Marks of Abolition, out from Duke. Her other recent publications include Res Nulla Loquitur and The Devil's Choice, Slavery and the Logic of the Vel. And I'm just going to put links to all of those in the chat. Thank you so much for doing this, Sora.
Thank you, Simon, for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and I'm just honored to share time with everyone here. And I'm sorry, I was really looking forward to actually reading aloud the bios. I'm going to post them again in the chat because I know that we are running close to the time when I think Josh needs to duck out. So I'm going to oh, why isn't this going? Okay. I will do this in bits and pieces. But so I want to hand the floor or give the floor over to Josh. And you can find his bio up here in the chat.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Simon and Sora and Daniel as well, in putting this event together. And I apologize, I have to hop off early for another call, but I'm really excited to share a few poems that really kind of come out of thinking about language and the law together, and specifically thinking about the types of grammar that gets embedded into law that can foreground or obscure the actors who are engaging in causing, whether it's legal injury or discrimination, whatever it may be. And so want to read a few poems in that vein. And I will start with a poem that is entitled Habeas Corpus as an Idea Entered Through a Postern Door. And habeas corpus is the legal concept of someone who's challenging their detention or their incarceration, and means kind of Latin translation is show me the body. Habeas corpus. Forego the natal rap sheet besieged by the width of your nose. The fact that you have a body is not a writ. Your halving is procedural. Just leave your things here, including your body, and come with us, not minding the rights and rights of self-possession, the exercise of outright control of your productive organs, of what you can inherit and bestow, that the state is a body that has you. Have you a state that delimits you beyond you, your choice, not a choice, but a writ, but a headless having. Your property is our concern. Your alienation, not just civil, but determinative. You don't belong. A broadening that you can have can't belong. This is just a matter of security. If you want to enter the building, that is. If you want to leave your body entirely, then proceed. Thank you. And that's one of kind of a number of poems that have come about from thinking about moving through one of the primary kind of outputs of the law, the prison, the jail, the detention center, and kind of the parts of oneself that are asked to be checked at the door, asked to be set aside, to be cognizable in law in terms of making claims, but then just as well in literally moving through this kind of space. The other poem I'm going to read today is a poem called Guilt by Association, and it is a poem that was written in the context of several kind of instances in the national media around people of color, especially Black folks, having the police called on them for engaging in everyday activities in public. And whether that's been bird watching or that's been having a picnic outdoors and not using the designated area. This poem is really a reflection on the idea that Blackness in public and criminality as perceived in public can be mapped onto bodies, not just actions, and what it means for a person to be criminalized as opposed to an act or something that one does. And funnily enough, my mom is on this call, and she gets a shout out in this poem as well. Guilt by association. How am I supposed to act around all this fight? Respond to dizzy hornets, silly crab apple trees, slapping smirks and eyebrow delight up on me. There is a daffodil threaded up in a shank of curl sponge hair. Apprehend this sunless afternoon. With such sweet glaze within galloping hills of green clashing downstream, haughty pedaling drops of music last night plowed me into a good sleep. And take me serious, no matter how shortened my life. My uncle's barbecue exists, and I had it. I was lawlessness. I was brush fire, the bug bites, box braids, pork loins in the pavilions. Me, myself, and I make an adjudicatory scene. So call the cops. Do it. Go ahead. You've done it before. You've always been doing it. You're doing it already, don't you? I didn't kill them. Just last week, I found a crew of ants circling a grain of rice that had leapt its way to the kitchen floor. And I didn't kill said ants, though I'm told I could have. I didn't kill them, despite their illegal enterprise. And even still, I didn't push the little invaders outside where it said they belong. I didn't. Whose good am I responsible to? I blink infinite susceptibility, and that triggers something in you, or so it seems. Here, those ants, this world, right? This one, wherein my mom buys 4 bags of Christmas blend coffee, even though I won't be home till June. A barista grinds the beans knowing no better, unaware the grounds won't be fresh when used, but by grinding, they are now party to a corruptive pursuit. Look, I won't explain the forethought criminal, nor rehash the snags of visual fear that constitutes the carceral prism of public space. I still don't know how to spend my life outside of debating whether or not I'm a yapping grave. But tell me, have you seen a striped-tailed scorpion try climbing out of a swimming pool? I too am disturbed. Contentment finds me, stupidly, immaculately, staring up, out, into, down. I spend most hours of most days and of nearing most of the years of my life not wanting to be alive. I don't know what to say. On a metal park bench, a lawn chair by a river, and Vermont, Cincinnati, February, June. A smile has parked itself briefly on my face after the morning cheers. And this summer, my mother expects to see me. She wants to tell me what door to exit at baggage claim. Hear me breathing as I buckle my seatbelt. Watch me the next morning drinking a hot drink under a hot sun, and her, an accomplice, any tidbits of caffeinated glee. Thank you so much. And I'll say one last thing before hopping off, which is one, just being thrilled by the fact this conversation is taking place and being able to read these poems. And I also want to mention I spent this past spring teaching a class on poetics and citizenship at a prison in upstate Connecticut, and thinking about the law, thinking about those who have been impacted by legal systems, and thinking about the role of lawyers and thinking about the language we use to talk about people and describe scenarios that have deep impacts on folks' lives. It's something that I was reminded of during that time teaching, and brought me back both to my experiences as a law student in the classroom, and then also moments where I've sat in court and listened to judges, jurists, lawyers use specific language to talk about people in ways that can shape the outcomes of their lives. So again, just really happy to be on the call, and I'll be on for a few more minutes for having to hop off.
Thanks, Josh. That was wonderful. Could I just ask really quickly, are any of those available in print?
Yes, so the poem Guilt by Association is in my chapbook, which is called To Be In and Of, from Pellet Poetry, and that's available on bookshops. You can get it from an independent bookseller as well as Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. The poem on habeas corpus is forthcoming in Poetry Journal.
Lovely. Thank you, Josh. I feel terrible that we had to cut short the intros, but the intro for Maggie is let me just post it again because we have quite a chat going, and because I do want to reserve time at the end of our meeting for questions. So I'm gonna just kind of again hand the mic over to Maggie Wang.
Hi. Yeah, let's just start by saying thank you, Josh. Those are wonderful poems, and I very much admire Josh's work, so I'm thrilled that he was able to read to all of you. So I'm Maggie. I'm in my third year of law school at Yale. Sometimes I write poems. I have in the past written a lot about the environment. For law school, I published a chapbook on extinction, the sixth mass extinction. And I'm still interested in those themes, but since I started law school, I've been puzzled by the special art forms of legal texts, statutes, judicial decisions, also legal case books. And one way of keeping alive the poetry part of me has been to use legal texts as the foundation for poems, and to use poems to excavate and interrogate and play with some of the weird things that law does with language. So I thought I would share some of the things I've been writing along those lines. And I won't go on for too long, but I thought I would start with a poem that I read this and built talk around it at the Law, Culture, and Humanities annual meeting 2 years ago, or a year ago, 2023, 2 meetings ago. So if you were there, you would have you may have heard this before. And some of the text I will paste into the chat. The first bit of this was published some months ago, and you can kind of follow along, but it's only the first couple of lines. So this is an erasure of the Supreme Court's opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, where I have, in which the Supreme Court struck down the right to abortion, or overturned the right to abortion, and basically what I've done is erased the opinion to leave only the words that are in the poem. So I'll read that to you. And I did the entire 80 pages of the opinion. It took a very long time. Make no mention of law or history. It is a crime to be. Much like stars, we are alone. The sky may try to wash out our light, but in the end, the years will be on our side. Right or wrong, the trees will tear the rain to pieces. Let weeks pass with no weight of flood on our backs. The state of being relevant is denied to spring. Instead, the maps point early toward the hard heat of half a dead summer. Kill one person accidentally, kill another on purpose. The weather could never tell one event from the other. Over the half-dark hills, the birds are donning the guise of being early. The insistence on fact does not mean they will let the worms get away. So too, the grasshoppers contend that the night is not a mystery, claim that this life is only potential, that the liberty of the grass is illicit. Do not question the distinction between centuries and seconds. People argue about how time is a human invention, but what does it matter to us? You and I, we may as well be moths eating into the pages of a history that does not belong to us. Our bodies are relics of an ancient civilization, discredited by the lenity of the hours. Fact-finding becomes the cynic, just as mortality does a flower. If the rain mistakes our mouths for resting place, we would not be allowed to complain. Years later, no one will care that we gave so little of our hearts away. Ambiguity is a problem only for snow before it melts. The glaciers make a burden of us. Nowhere is safe from the strict rules of amnesia. Cast doubt in different terms, yet it will be no more sure of itself. Comport with the doctrine of the seasons, and you may still find yourself caught off guard by the beauty of the days at war with an enemy you cannot name, such that you can only say it is so ordered. So this poem took me more than a year to finish. It was very difficult to erase. I think making erasures is really exhausting because you kind of have to work with the text, but then you're looking for the words that you want, and it was sometimes quite difficult to find the words that I wanted, also especially because I wanted to keep each word within a single line, but the margins in Supreme Court opinions are very narrow. So technically this was a difficult piece to make, but it was also, but then in reading it, in making this, I read the opinion closely over and over, and it was just really painful every time. So I finally have written this. I wrote this after a year, and when I was said, and then I've kind of shared with people, and some people have had really interesting reactions. So one of these was when I first said I was doing this reading on law and poetry. Somebody said to me, "Oh God, why would anyone ever combine law and poetry?" Meaning that law as this terrible, exploitative, oppressive monster, and poetry as this beautiful, idyllic art form don't belong together. And in this poem and elsewhere, I'm trying to push back against that, and to kind of illustrate how poetry might help us make sense of the law. And I think if poems are to be faithful representations of human experience, or meaningful conduits for human emotion, then they have to include the ugliness of the world as well as the birds and flowers. And I think likewise, law is Law is fiction in the sense that it's invented. It's arbitrary, and legal texts are just texts. There's nothing exceptional about them, except that they're powerful because we make them powerful. And they deserve and need to be challenged and stretched and turned inside out and read backwards like every other text. And by doing that, I think we might better understand what it means to wield and to live under the power of the law. I also think legal texts are historical texts. They're texts that condense human experience and human memory, and they reflect the moments they're created in and the people who create and receive them. So with that, I want to read a second piece. This is it's called Your Return, and it's built on text from the Internal Revenue Services instructions for Form 1040 for the last tax year 2023. And so for those not from the US or who don't know, Form 1040 is the US individual income tax return, basically a form you fill out when you file your taxes. And the IRS publishes these like long instructions, which are hundreds of pages long, that tell you how to fill out every item in this form. So I've taken this text entirely from that set of instructions. And again, it's called Your Return. Your return is complicated. Your return will determine nothing and everything. Your return must reconcile last time with this time. If certain conditions apply, you can return at the end of the year. On your return, you must qualify for the continued opportunity of living. You qualify if, on the date of your return, you meet one of the following conditions. You changed your name because of marriage or divorce. Your name is your name. You chose your name. Your name chose your return. Your return is timely. Do not return unless asked to do so. Before making your return, please consider the effect on others. Cutting short your return may cause problems in processing. If you choose not to return this year, the world may disallow your return in the future. You may not claim a loss when you have none. You are responsible for the correctness of your return. You want an acknowledgement that your return was received and accepted. You must answer any questions that arise during your return. If you miss the original date of your return, you will owe interest and may owe penalties. To avoid interest and penalties, make your return on time. You may owe a fee for your return, but you should not pay this fee. Instead, keep your return secret. Keep it between us. Do not read too much into your return. For most people, your return means nothing. The world does not wait for your return, only we do. So, this is a poem about taxes, but it's also a love poem. It's a poem about bureaucracy and a poem about home. And in law, a lot of words don't mean what they colloquially mean. This is especially true in tax law, where there are a lot of tax-specific meanings. So, for example, the phrase ordinary and necessary, which in tax law is used to describe certain business expenses that you can deduct on your taxes, in tax law doesn't actually mean ordinary or necessary. And then there are words that don't seem to really mean anything at all, except in the law, where they accumulate these meanings that we ascribe to them, that are kind of illogical if we think about them. So the term tax return, environmental law, the term criteria pollutant, which doesn't really mean anything in normal English, but means something in environmental law. And I'm interested in playing with these ideas, this idea of like specific kind of these like law or tax specific meanings, and how they might entrench certain power structures or do violence in certain ways, and how they might kind of give weight or value to certain experiences or views, and how they might sideline others. So this poem, Your Return, has turned into a bigger project on tax law and poetry that I'm working on, which is still in the earlier stages, but I'm interested in interrogating it. There are a whole bunch of different tax concepts and phrases that I'm thinking about and turning them into poems. I'm also turning this poem into a sort of a film poem, where I've just recorded it and kind of taken some footage that I think is interesting or that the text evokes. And I'm hoping to do that with some others as well, which is not as related to legal themes, but I'm interested in just exploring different media in my work. I've been working as well on some audio poems, which are not spoken word, but more like experimental sort of sound pieces born in audio form. And it's kind of all part of this like taxation project. I think all this is part of an interest that I have in absurdity and unexpected results and mapping out different roads that a reader or listener might choose to take. And with that, I want to share another piece. This one is called As a Matter of Fact, and it's based on a text, the first paragraph from a Second Circuit Court of Appeals opinion in 2021 called City of New York versus Chevron. And in this case, the City of New York sued 5 major oil companies, including Chevron, basically making trespass and nuisance claims, seeking to recover damages for harms caused by climate change. So I sort of took the first paragraph of the text and then did with it what I wanted, kind of in illustrating how the court did what it wanted with the lives of people affected by climate change. So it's called As a Matter of Fact. The uncertainty before us is whether clouds may utilize the rain to hold birds liable for the forgetfulness caused by global warming. Given the unpredictability of history and the existence of a complex atmosphere of understandings regulating our lives, we hold that the promise is broken. Extinction presents a uniquely international certainty of national gloom. It is therefore not well suited to the intricacies of thought. Consistent with that tragedy, ferns are the subject of numerous eulogies and international agreements. These items provide interlocking commitments for regulating movement, as well as punishments to ensure their instructions are followed. Humanity has sidestepped these memories and instituted a war against the butterflies to recover floods caused by its admittedly legal activities in producing and selling knowledge around the world. In so doing, man effectively seeks to replace these carefully crafted lives, which are the product of natural selection, with a dearth of freedom under fabricated law. For many of the same reasons stated by the protesters, we cannot condone such a surprise. We affirm the virtue of the birds. So this poem and the previous ones as well are sort of meant to only they're meant to only kind of make sense. And the idea behind them is that law often doesn't make sense, especially decisions like this one that come up with all sorts of excuses not to act on an urgent and critical problem like climate change. Especially when these reasons are legally legitimate, but also intuitively or morally questionable in all sorts of ways. I do write things that make more sense and that follow a clearer logic or arc. But law school has also unsettled in me the notion that poetry has to make sense or that writing or language has to make sense. So in my writing now, I'm interested in just playing with the different meanings that words can have as a way of recovering or holding on to the whimsicality of language, which law, especially now in an age of originalism and new textualism, is pushing back against or denying or suppressing. So, and I've kind of done things with other kinds of texts as well, historical documents, novels, but I've kind of chosen legal text just to fit the theme of this reading. I guess I want to conclude by saying, I think law is lived experience, but it's also a record of who we are. It's about rules and our understandings of them. Law is about interpretation. It's about putting together puzzle pieces. It's a matter of reading the lines and also reading between the lines. It's a poetry and it's a craft. It's a practice and a craft, and poetry is exactly the same way. I was going to end with reading another erasure of a Supreme Court opinion, but I decided read something more recent and a little further removed from the law, but kind of also it's related to the law. And I think this is kind of where thinking generously about language has gotten me most recently. So this is called "Let the Night Be Dark," and that's a line from Robert Frost. Not pitch like ink from the overflowing pen, or asphalt still wet on pliant ground. No, I mean let it be dark like the sea is dark, full of shiny, glittering, glowing things, sea walnuts, crystal jellies, parchment worms, firefly squid, eyelight fish. Let it be dark like the marvel of an ocean floor, dark with northern lights and Perseids, quadrantids, and comets passing once in a lifetime, a mere blip in the brightness of the universe. Let the night be dark like it would be on another planet tangoing around another sun. Dark like the great gaping stomach of the moon, or the gaps between constellations, which are merely filled with stars you cannot see. Yes, let the night sparkle the way your eyes do right after you close them, with those little flashes, which, by the way, are called phosphenes. Let us turn out the street lamps now. Let the wires in the light bulbs lay to rest our fear of dazzling night, radiant, luminous, lustrous, shimmering night. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Maggie. So Larry, I think
Can
that
you
we
hear
can
me?
hear you. Yes.
You can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm on the phone.
Brilliant.
I want to apologize to all the participants and everybody because I've been having a little bit of trouble getting in on this, which is entirely my fault. But you can all hear me now.
Yes, we can. And we are
Okay.
so grateful that we can.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your patience. And I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Simon and you, Sora, and Josh and Maggie. I was able to hear their presentations, which were wonderful. Let me give a little bit of background before I want to read from read several poems. I began writing poetry. I've been somewhat ancient on this now, relative to where we are now with law and literature and law and poetry. But I began during my freshman year at Michigan back in 1967, and then since then I've been committed to making poems. I began law as a law student in 1973, again at Michigan. After law school, I clerked for a justice on the Michigan Supreme Court, and then I taught law in Detroit. And then in 1981, I moved to New York City, where I practiced law. And then I returned to teaching in 1987 at St. John's in Queens. And then I retired from teaching in 2020. As with Josh and Maggie, if you write poems and you're also involved with law in some kind of formal way from law school, beginning with law school, and I always think of my beginning of my legal career as my first day in law school, because I was inundated in this language that I thought I knew something about it and whatever, but law school transforms the way you think. Not only you learn this language, which takes a long time to become proficient in, if you're ever proficient in it, and it also changes the way you think. I'd been writing poetry before then and made the decision to go to law school in great part to protect my poetry, because of the having basically decided to have two careers. One, a vocational career, which I had every intention, still have every intention of doing as long as I can, and the other, a professional career, which would allow me to protect the work and at the time that I went to law school, the creative writing world, MFA world, had just pretty much begun, and from the background I'm from, which is a lower middle class, working class background, I wanted to have some kind of economic security, for lack of a better word, and I decided I would do both. I've lived in the language and practice of poetry now for almost 60 years, and that's ongoing and every day. I've lived in the language of law actively and in practice up until the time I retired, and of course I follow everything. Law, I've thought about before I went to law school, and have been thinking of constantly the relationship between the two. There are obviously different types of, for lack of a better word, or phrase, language games. The language of poetry and the practice of poetry are essentially aesthetic. You're trying to make poems, and you fold into all of the traditions and ways and reading and everything on and how to do that. And then you begin to develop or try to develop as a poet or one who writes poetry. Language of law is essentially, it's hard to describe, but what the essence of it for me has always been that it's a social language, and it's a language in the United States. It's a very significant language. It literally goes throughout our entire society, and at the basis of our society. Deals with power, deals with distribution of wealth, deals with crime and punishment, deals with politics, deals with power. And being in the language of law as long as I've been in it has given me access to this kind of language in terms of my poetry when I need, and as I do imaginatively, to go into the world, the social world and worlds of power and whatever, which I was doing before I went to law school. And so it's been a kind of symbiotic relationship on language terms for now over 50 years of this kind of back and forth. And it's constant. I'm constantly in the world of being in the world of poetry, and I'm constantly in the language of law in some kind of way. You don't give it up after, once you begin to think like that, and which starts in law school. I mean, law school, you think about law differently after you've gone to law school. And then how you continue as someone who has studied law than people that haven't done that, who obviously know a lot about law, as we all do. Every American is inundated in law and systems of law. The difference between poetry and another essential difference between poetry and law is that it's a very different kind of world when you're making aesthetic objects of like you are with poetry, where you're dealing with issues of all sorts of technical issues, traditional issues, themes, your motifs, your subjects. Poetry is not a power language. Poetry has no power other than the power of the making of the poem. Legal language is all power. Ultimately, you can trace it all down to power issues, to use a legal term, which is also a poetic term. But if you write about issues of power and social issues that I have from the beginning of my work, having been a lawyer and knowing the language of law has become integral and involved in every poem I write. From the beginning of my of what became my first book, I injected a lawyer self into my poems, not as part of other selves. And so I had a lawyer self, and it exists, and it has in my work existed alongside other selves expressed in the poems, which include being an Arab American, being grown up Catholic, a Detroiter, and a New Yorker, and so, and a poet. One of my selves is the poet writing the poem, but there's also a lawyer self in there, and sometimes it takes on in the poems more expression than it does at other times. I'm going to read a couple of poems, I want to start with a poem that's the title poem of my second book, which brings into play these multiple selves, including the lawyer self. The poem was written in the early 1980s, and it's entitled Curriculum Vitae, which of course is with a CV, and I meant it metaphorically as a title. In other words, I'm laying out my life, the running of my life, if you like. And the purpose of a curriculum vitae is to establish your identity, and finally to get a job. And so I thought of this in those kind of terms. Curriculum vitae. I might have been born in Beirut, not Detroit, with my right name. Grandpa taught me to love to eat. I am not Orthodox or Sunni, Shiite or Druze. Baptized in the one true church, I too was weaned on St. Augustine. Eisenhower never dreamed I wore corrective shoes. Ford Motor Company never cared I'd never forgive Highland Park, River Rouge, Hamtramck. I memorized the Baltimore Catechism. I collected holy cards, prayed to a litany of saints to intercede on behalf of my father, who slept through the sermon at 7 o'clock Mass. He worked 2 jobs, believed himself a failure. My brother believed himself, my sister denied. In the 5th grade, Sister Victorine, astonished, listened to me recite from the book of Jeremiah. My voice changed. I wanted women. The Jesuit, whose yellow fingers cracked with the stink of camels, promised me eternal punishment. How strange I was, with impure thoughts, brown skin, obsessions. You could tell by the way I walked, I possessed a lot of soul. You could tell by the way I talked, I didn't know when to stop. After I witnessed stabbings outside the gym, after the game, I witnessed fire in the streets. My head set on fire in Cambridge, England, in the Wim Cafe. After I applied substance and procedure and statements of facts, my head was heavy, was earth. Now years have passed since I came to the city of great fame. The same sun glows gray on 2 new rivers. Tears I want do not come. I remain many different people whose families populate half Detroit. I hate the racket of the machines, the oven's heat, curse bossmen behind their backs. I hear the inmates' collective murmur in the jail on Beaubien Street. I hear myself say, what explains the Bank of Lebanon's liquidity? Think, I too will declare a doctrine upon whom the loss of language must fall, regardless whether Wallace Stevens understood senior indebtedness in Greenwich Village in 1905. One woman hears me in my sleep plead the confusions of my dream. I frequent the Cafe Dante, earn my memories, repay my moods. I'm as good as my heart. I'm as good as the unemployed who wait in long lines for money. There's a reference at the end of toward the end of the poem after I announce that I've applying substance and procedure and statements of facts, an allusion to the fact that I'm a lawyer. It's a reference to Wallace Stevens, who was a surety bond lawyer and a poet that never put the identity of a lawyer into his poems. And so I play on that. I play on a question that would go through the mind of a lawyer poet. I too will declare a doctrine upon whom the loss of language must fall, regardless whether Wallace Stevens understood senior indebtedness in Greenwich Village in 1905. Senior indebtedness, I didn't know what that was, of course, until I came across it when I was practicing law in New York City. Once I moved to New York City, and I still couldn't tell you what senior indebtedness is in a bond, but I had to figure it out. And so I decided to mix it and put it in this poem in my curriculum vitae. The next poem is entitled Any and All, and this is set on Wall Street. The firm I worked for was actually, offices were on Wall Street at the time. And here the lawyer identity is quite pronounced. Any and all. I had in mind when I was writing this the short story by Herman Melville, whose brothers were lawyers and whose father-in-law was Lemuel Shaw, the famous Chief Judge of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Supreme Court, and known for his opinion on the fugitive slave law. But I had in mind Melville when I was writing this. Any and all. You draw nearer to see her more closely. The blind woman by the bronze doors of the old merchant's bank, her mouth wide open as if in a silent roar, several dollars stuffed in the pockets of her mink coat. She's easy to forget a few days later when you think of her, not long. The phone is ringing. You put Birdman on hold. Poland wants you in his office immediately. The lawyers from Mars and the bankers from Switzerland have arrived to close the deal. The money in their heads articulated to the debt of the state of Bolivia. How much later the Croatian woman who empties the wastebaskets laughs when you answer you've been better and you've been worse. How much sooner you're told not to tell anyone Birdman's grandfather was a Jew. How much number 54 Wall Street, emblematic reality of extreme speculations and final effects. The other evening, a party in the West 60s, you say as much. None of them knows what any of it's worth, you say to yourself later, spitting into an unexpected breeze. Yellow moons of street lamps on 9th Avenue, obscured by atmospheric soot and fog. In the 20s, empty windows of butcher shops, factories, and warehouses without names. No taxis, the green light behind the window of a corner bar. A young man sporting muscles, a woman he might own on his arm, clearly doesn't like the way you look or look at him, lets his leash out enough for his wolf dog to just nip your leg. Another day you contemplate your strategy. Think about how they think about you, thinking about them, and the look on your face to prove you have the proper attitude. Let no laughter reveal moods. Let Charlotte Stone reveal that her father, over the weekend, purchased a peninsula in Rhode Island for Harry and her. Let her teeth be too large and too gray. There is blood and there is bloodletting. This is not your blood. Shut the door and wait. Someone else's father forgives you when you know not what you do. Reminds you, he's a weasel, but he's my friend. You're a monkey, and you work for him. Decide for him whether his clauses should be restrictive, whether to replace every any with all.
Thanks, Larry. That was really amazing. I think we have time for one more because we have to quit at around 1:30 and we wanted to have about 15 minutes for discussion.
Oh, great. I'll read a poem that was in my last book in 9 small parts called In Parentheses. 1. As I said, I'm a lawyer. Technically speaking, is a head blown to pieces by a smart bomb a beheading? 2. Infinitely compressible, yet expandable, time and curved space. And the preface to Lucretius's first book of De Rerum Natura is a tribute to Venus, and the last book a description of the plague. 3. In the techno-capital sphere, absolute principles of profit growth, of value accumulation, the absolute freedom to recombine the production of raw materials into virtual information in spaces of time, infotime. 5. Hyperviolence is the word of epic proportions, a species thing, the point at which violence becomes ontology, these endless, ambitious experiments in destruction, a species grief. 6. Quite often, almost daily, in fact, I have strong impressions of eternity. My ancestors are there too, in the shadows. My mother, my father, grandmothers, grandfathers, whom I refuse to let perish, whispering to me to be careful. 7. What's that about? Someone I heard say that to say that Hispanics are East Asian is sort of like saying that Arabs are white. 8. Hear that? That man's face being stepped on, skull being cracked by the baton stick, head slammed against the concrete edge, blood in his eyes, body limp, in the process now of being handcuffed. 10. I'm speaking of a law now, understand? That point at which bodies locked in cages become ontology. The point at which structures of cruelty, force, war become ontology. The analog is what I believe in. The reconstruction of the phenomenology of perception, not according to a machine. More now for the imagination to affix to than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Just stunning to hear both you and Maggie and Josh read. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to open it up. I noted that there are questions in the chat, and I think the first question was one typed in by Melissa. I don't know, Melissa, whether you wanted to ask your question.
Hi. Yeah, thank you all so much. This was just absolutely fascinating. Sorry for that printing noise in the background. Yeah, my question, I'll see if I can shut it off. I was wondering if you could speak, really each of you a bit about the influences on your work, perhaps specific authors, texts, or experiences. Like, I assume actual legal decisions that you were erasing and modifying, Maggie, were obviously figuring importantly in your work as well. But yeah, we'd just love to hear any and all other thoughts about that.
Maggie, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I should have a better answer to this. I don't. I should perhaps think about this. I think so. So in the poems I read today, the actual legal text, and I had I think I may have read similar kinds of things elsewhere, but I feel like a lot of the erasures I've read are interesting, but not not as grounded in the original. So I think, oh, now I remember, like some folks there are people who've done like really good erasures before that have stuck in my head. So I think Layli Long Soldier and Whereas has done like similar things, or not necessarily erasures, but like worked with legal texts and try to kind of counter or like pull apart their mechanisms and like their oppressive power, and like have worked with, just like done very interesting and moving things with legal texts. I don't know if I've seen like opinion erasures before, but this one, when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is so just painful to read, and what can I, but surely I can do something with it. And I so I thought, well, I can use it, and like I can put my own voice into it and like use the language of this opinion and make it mine. So that's where that came from. I think for the other things I wrote, it's sort of kind of just depends on, some of these will be responses to like things I've read. So like when I wrote the very last poem, Let the Night Be Dark, I've been reading a lot of fiction and not a lot of legal text, which is why I had come up with all these, like used a lot of synonyms or like words to describe light that I hadn't a lot of before. But then like for I think the other poems, especially the one based on the excerpt of New York versus Chevron, like these are kind of just a little bit like glorified products of like writing workshop exercises, where you have just like kind of take random words and like write what comes to mind. Um, and I have tried to kind of use that to um that's that's not for me. I guess I'm taking that out of the realm of like the writing workshop and making it an actual like poem that I present to others, that hope that I like that's like my version of what I think when I read these texts. So that's not very responsive to your question in terms of influences. There's things I read, or like the ways I read these opinions. There's like a very specific language that phrases or ways of using language that if you go and read like the City of New York versus Chevron opinion, or like you'll see patterns of words that are very, like, legal writing's very obscure. So I'm interested in like how these like kind of obscure and circuitous uses of language might be turned into poems. Yeah, Larry probably has a much better answer than I do.
I know that was fantastic.
No, I'm not sure I have. That was a great answer, and I understood exactly what you were saying. What happens when you begin to immerse yourself in the language of law? All sorts of things, texts take on interest, and you read differently. And one thing that lawyers and poets have in common, other than the fact that they both deal with language predominantly, is the focusing on different types of language, and being attentive to certain types of language. And when you read, lawyers and poets are readers, and because they live in the language of poetry and the language of law, and so you're constantly everything you read in one way or multiple ways is connecting imaginatively into your lawyer self and your poet self. And when you're looking at legal texts or poetic texts or literary texts and whatever, you're kind of just absorbing it all in whatever way you can. And this process begins very early on if you're both a poet writing poetry and you're in the world of law. And then it constantly is evolving and changing and growing and very much responsive to what's going on in the worlds of poetry, on your own development as a poet, but also in the worlds of law, which include everything. Every social dimension of America is tied into law at some level. And so you're constantly, I see it as this ongoing process, which has been so much a part of my life since I started law school, of going into worlds of, I mean, you can see legal language everywhere, and then what you do is you use that in whatever way you need to use it as a poet, and each of us as poets, we develop that differently because we're different as poets, but we're all trying to write poems, and if we have access to legal language, which we do, not everybody does. Everybody reads it all the time, hears it, sees it all the time through all types of media. But we study it. I mean, we live in it, and we also live in the language of poetry. And so we're constantly moving that around. It's always wonderful for me. I was going to say fascinating, but it's more now at this point for me wonderful to see poets who are also studied law and become lawyers and live in the language of law in some kind of way, and then live in the language of poetry, just confronting these overlaps in this society we live in, an American society where the predominance of law mythically, actually, and whatever, is so overwhelming, but we have a kind of insider's knowledge as lawyers, and we have a kind of insider's perspective, the insider's perspective as poets. And so I think that's a general way of answering it, but that would be, I hope, answers your question in some kind of way.
Thank you. Nicole Wright had a question earlier in the chat, and I don't know, Nicole, whether you want to jump in and ask your question.
Okay. Yes, my question was building off what Maggie was talking about making sense of law, making sense in poetry. I think one thing I've heard about the Dobbs decision and other decisions recently coming out of the Supreme Court is this logic doesn't make sense, or they're twisting these historical sources in ways that don't comport with how historians understand the meaning of these texts. And so I'm wondering, for Maggie and also for Lawrence, I'm wondering, have you ever come across poetry about or by lawyers that it contains or includes instructions at the beginning as to how to interpret this poem, or how to make sense of it in the way that we see at the beginning of some of the forms and other legal instruments that you discussed? Thanks.
I'll go first. I can't say something comes immediately to mind in terms of your question, Nicole. I taught most of my legal career at St. John's, and I taught a course in kind of advanced course in legal seminar in legal interpretation, where we would look at legal texts very closely and try to figure out what they meant. And I didn't do any kind of poetic analysis or critical analysis as a poet into it, but I did critical analysis as a lawyer, and trying to figure out what was going on in terms of the way the language worked in opinions, which is where most of us focus on, especially those of us who are closer to law school. Focus on opinions and what opinions do. And that was, I had this class was very, very instructive for me, and hopefully it was for the students also. And it was a seminar class, which I always loved teaching. I'm not sure that answers your question, but the legal opinions are a source of interpretation, and poets interpret. They are constantly interpreting all sorts of reality. And so a poet comes to a legal text, and any legal text, and is going to see things that a person who's a poet that's not a lawyer, who has studied law, is not going to see. And it goes to the core, because law goes to the core of American society. And so you can get a kind of social read out of opinions. And there's been an enormous amount done on this, which is just wonderful to see, this kind of interpretation of and adapting form to it and whatever, in terms of analyzing opinions and taking stuff out, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So your question is really interesting, and now, so I haven't seen these kinds of setting the interpretive guidelines or rules for interpretation, but now maybe you could write that if you write, or now I might do that. I write something very tongue-in-cheek that says here are the canons you should apply to interpreting the following poems. But I think that I think that what's interesting about law and making sense is that a lot of law is like I said when I was reading, law is arbitrary, and it's these are my very legal realist views, but mandatory minimums, or the procedural rules like the statute of limitations, or who even the very fundamental, what causes of action can you bring. These are all they're very arbitrary things, and that's not to say they're totally random, but they're products of our time. They're kind of they're historically contingent, and they're based on who has power, and what those people, whether the people in power had breakfast or what they had for breakfast. So I think and poetry is a way of playing with words to with the end of revealing the arbitrariness and kind of irrationality of law. And I think that would be really interesting to try and put rules on that. But I think when courts try to apply rules to and then when they as the current Supreme Court is doing kind of depict their rules, or perceive or try to depict their rules as coming out of this a greater logical order handed down from on high. I think it's ironic and sort of almost comical, and I'm trying to get at that a little bit in these poems. So yeah, but thank you for the question. It's a really interesting idea.
Thanks so much. Yes, I was thinking about as you read, Christine Penny Legion had a poem in Plain Songs last year about, kind of with these cheeky instructions for how to make sense of poetry, and it reminded me of your verse. So thank you again.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll look that up.
Well, we are right at 10:30, and I have to say I'm so glad that we got to start this conversation. It seems like there's just so much interest and so much aliveness that's sparked with hearing poetry, and especially thinking about the writing and the auditory nature of it in relationship to contesting law from the inside. It's just been a phenomenal experience, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. There is another Zoom panel coming up on October 3rd. So look for that announcement. Maggie, Larry, your poetry and your readings were phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, sharing your words.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you.